Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. It's been a while since I've talked about lifestyle and aestheticism on this channel, and I definitely feel like it's time to revisit that neighborhood of ideas because I miss talking about it. And I want to make sure those who follow me, especially if you're new, know that worship of beauty and aestheticism is at the heart of this channel, and it always will be. So I have to make sure that that's still a top priority, so as to stay true to myself and truthful to all of you lovely people. So whenever I got a comment on a community post about talking about the difference between sensuality and sexuality, I kind of jumped right at it and got very excited. I was asked to define the two and to discern the difference between the two. So in this video I'm going to do that, but I'm more so going to be talking about how sensuality can inspire a lifestyle that I personally believe promotes fulfillment and peace. Most of the video is going to be me outlining this way of life. And I'm sure those of you who have followed me for a long time are going to recognize the pillars of an aesthetic life in the sensuous life, or the sensual life, as I will intentionally conflate the two in this video. So here we go. So there's a point that I really need to make before I get into the description of the lifestyle itself. We need to talk about words, what words mean, how words are said, because this contributes to the confusion between sexual and sensual. We're gonna get kind of heavy into semantics in this video. It's kind of unavoidable to a certain extent, especially when talking about like philosophy and things like that. The word sensual is very easily attributed a sexual connotation, and I don't believe that sensual, the word, should be used in that way. To me, there is a reason why sexual and sensual are separate words. They are different words. Just the contrast of enunciation and emphasis between the two words, sexual and sensual, makes this obvious to me. When sexual is used, it has a carnal and kind of aggressive disposition in comparison to the softer, lighter sensual. Sensual is more reserved and elusive sounding. Sexual is bright red, while sensual is kind of like a mauve color. Does anybody else attribute colors to words or days of the week, or does anybody else do that here? This kind of intention with words has been the driving force for poets for hundreds of years, and I think it needs to be addressed. You know, words have undertones and shades. They have more potential than being carelessly used in small talk or in an instructional way. I mean, new words are created every day to identify a very, very, very small sliver of human experience. There are words in other languages that don't even translate into our language because they're so specific to the culture in which they belong. In fact, there are entire languages that are created this way, so much so that it makes it impossible, almost impossible, for an outsider to even learn the language. Language is a fascinating but tricky bastard in this way. A kind of self-defeating system, really, but... Alright, so having brought that to everyone's attention, sexual means to be overtly so, to literally reek of pheromones. Sexual is direct, about one thing and one thing only. Sensual, on the other hand, means to be subdued and mysterious, halfway between the mind and physical gratification. Sex is definitely there, but it's more of an idea, a kind of hazy recollection of something familiar. And yes, sensual does mean to gratify the senses, and yes, one of the senses is touch, and sex definitely gratifies. But sensual means to lie on the surface, not to necessarily venture within, if you know what I mean. If there is sex, it is an undertone, and it stays obscured in that way. And there is a great beauty in that. Living sensually gratifies in an intentional way with a kind of adeptness and gentleness. The sensual person understands the delicate nature of the senses and knows not to overstimulate them. And this can be done in many ways. You know, some people do it with drugs, some people do it with trying to experience the same thing over and over and over again, trying to recreate a moment, whatever. However, when the senses are taken into consideration, they kind of unfurl and they kind of multiply inwardly, and each succession becomes more refined. And this is always done through restriction, and we'll revisit restriction a little bit later. It's kind of the difference between milk chocolate and like 100% cacao. It's the same thing with the difference between a kiss and somebody grazing your arm with their hand. When you live sensually, you become perceptive. A sensual life is one of subtlety and of intention so as to get the most pleasure out of life. It is to be satisfied with the finer things. And when I use the word fine, I mean fine as in small, almost like microscopic, kind of like fine like powder. To live a sensual life is to develop a masterful sensitivity. A sensual life, therefore, means to live intimately connected with yourself and with the world around you. And it's not to say you can't live a sexual life. I'm fascinated by those who do, but that's not what I'm promoting here. So we're not going to talk about a sexual life. Now, a sensual life is one filled with pleasure and desire. And everything that I will talk about after this is colored by those two things. And even though this is one of the most paramount things to understand about sensualism, it's thankfully one of the easier things to explain. A sensualist lives for pleasure and desire, but isn't necessarily satisfied by possession of whatever it is they're after, especially in matters of love. The sensualist can maintain a very artful distance from just about anything or anyone. This is kind of what separates the sensualist from the sexual person. A sensualist is satisfied by an idea, by a memory, a detail, so much so that the most trivial things will explode with significance and complexity and heat. A sensual person is a sexual being nonetheless, but they can feel you without touching you. A sensual person's erogenous zone is their mind, and because of this, they look at everyday life as a kind of opportunity for pleasure. So keeping that in mind, we can continue. A sensual life, much like an aesthetic life, is filled with ritual and ceremony for the most unconsidered things, such as painting your toenails or going for a walk. A sensualist will enhance minuscule things by ritualizing them. A sensual life also promotes the loss of time, the loss of self. There is a desire to reach what is known as ecstasis, and I talked about this in my Dionysian cults video. Ecstasy, the word, comes from the Greek word ekstasis, which means to stand outside oneself, a removal to elsewhere. The goal of a sensual life is to achieve the state of ecstasis by immersion in the finite details of life, by immersing themselves in a kind of sensitivity, a kind of microscopic beauty. As far as the removal of self goes, or a kind of transcendent state, I have in the past used the word indifference to kind of describe it, kind of hint at it, I guess. I didn't know what ecstasis was when I was talking about indifference in my earlier videos, but I definitely feel that indifference is more of a characteristic or a disposition, while ecstasis is kind of like a meditative state, an achieved state, something that you can go in and out of. And especially in today's world, I mean, the sensualist must often surrender to the paradigms that interfere with ecstasis, which is like everything. So to reiterate, the goal of a sensual life is to reach a heightened state, and this is observed in every aspect of a sensualist's life. Who they surround themselves with, how they design their living space, how they choose to spend their time, what they collect, what they pursue, what they eat, their taste in music or clothing, how they spend their money, and especially how they love. A sensualist is very often an aesthete as well. They curate everything in their life. Things are carefully chosen, not accepted. Beauty is preferred and subtlety is always an art form. To tie in a point from earlier about restriction, curation is a form of restriction, and restriction is a kind of discipline. This kind of discipline is also an indication of good taste. For a sensualist, talked about time before on this channel, time is discarded. Time is the enemy of leisure, the enemy of ecstasis. It sabotages the focus required to achieve ecstasis, for experiencing subtlety in general. For this reason, a sensualist will enjoy their solitude above all other activities. Because when you're alone, there's no discontinuation of this ecstasis state. You can hold it for really as long as you choose, as long as you don't have to like go to work and talk to people. But unfortunately, it's pretty much impossible to keep that state of ecstasis because we all have to interact with the world at some point. Just as the pacifist longs for the end of violence, the sensualist longs for the continuation of refined pleasure, which is kind of a paradox to the sensualist philosophy, but it is a longing nonetheless. This is kind of the reason why I included the Anais Nin quote in the beginning. There is a certain melancholia within every sensualist, a kind of neutral sadness caused by the human condition. The fact that a sensualist cannot be released from this condition long enough to kind of ascend, to be godlike. And it's actually interesting because while researching ecstasis, I came upon another Greek word that complements ecstasis. It's a word from Plato, and I believe it's pronounced enthusiasmos, which means the God within. So during these moments of ecstasis, you stand outside of yourself and see God within you. It's just funny how all of these concepts just intertwine and they all seem to interact with one another and consistently are getting thrown together. Like they're all just in the same family. And forever these concepts have been like this. Ecstasy, discipline, God, art, restriction, beauty, subtlety, all of it. Always, forever. Anyway, I feel like I said a lot in this video, so I'll try and ingrain the most important notes. And I'm gonna have them written on the screen like commandments, because I think that's poetic and fun. The sensual life is one of subtlety. The sensualist lives for pleasure and desire. The sensualist prioritizes value of substance. A sensualist is a curator, an aesthete, an artist. A sensualist longs for continuity of pleasure. A sensualist longs to hold hands with God. A sensualist is perceptive. A sensualist is ascetic. A sensualist's goal is ecstasis. A sensualist achieves ecstasis through restriction of the senses. The sensual life is one of artistic abstention. Alright guys, that is the end of this video. I really enjoyed writing the script for this and talking about this. And I'm gonna expand upon this subject in the coming videos. I actually came upon a very interesting French word, jouissance. Lacan talked about it, and I want to listen to one of his lectures and learn more about it and then kind of report back to you guys on what I've learned, because it's fascinating. From what I've read already, it seems to be absolutely fascinating. It's a pleasure that can't really be defined and can't be translated in between languages, as it's a French word, and talking about subtlety, just the subtlety of like what it means and how it applies to desire and sex and life, and very fascinating. So we are going to continue on this path towards sensuality and maybe write a damn manifesto about it. I'm very excited. I'm very satisfied talking about stuff like this. I can say I'm deriving great pleasure from all of this, as I would definitely, the more I kind of develop these ideas, the more I definitely consider myself a part of this kind of lifestyle for sure, or at least want to make myself a part of it. As always, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think about all of this. Write your heart out in the comments, your experiences, your philosophies, whatever contribution you'd like to make. Yeah, I will see you guys next week. Bye.